Now, Charles Murray has been a good friend of the National Center for Policy Analysis for a long time. We've had him at a number of our events. This new book that he's written is getting an incredible amount of attention. In the New York Times this morning, Nicholas Kristof, the liberal, wrote a column which basically praised everything Charles had to say. I think there was only one negative paragraph. And I'm a blogger, as a lot of you know, and his book is being discussed at all the blogs these days. So I'm going to sit down and let you hear what he has to say, because it'll be more interesting than what I have to say about him. Charles, if you'll come up here, let's give him a warm Dallas welcome.
Thank you very much, John. People have been asking me if this is part of a book tour, and the answer is no. This is the only stop in the book tour. The NCPA offered to do this lunch, and I jumped at it because basically Catherine, my wife Catherine, who's here, and I have three sets of close friends, one in Washington, D.C., one around Burkittsville, Maryland, where we live, and the third is here in Dallas, Texas, thanks to my friendship with Harlan Crow that goes back 17 years, and all the people that I have met through him, many of whom I see around the audience here. As for the talk today, the good news, if you're like me, is that it has nothing whatsoever to do with current politics. I am not going to say anything about Mitt, Newt, Ron, or Rick, which sounds sort of like a 50s singing group, you know. Nothing about President Obama, nothing about the deficit, nothing about anything that has happened since January 2009. The issues I'm talking about have nothing to do with anything that's happened in the last 3 years. And frankly, they aren't going to be affected very much by the results of next fall's election, especially considering the candidates we're stuck with. The thesis of this book, I did say something about contemporary politics. I didn't mean to, it just came out. It's not on the page here. The thesis of the book, which is called Coming Apart, is simple. Over the last half century, the United States has seen a widening cultural inequality, not income inequality, but cultural inequality. We have developed a new lower class and a new upper class that are different in kind from anything that this country has ever known before. The second contention of the book is that the divergence of America into these separate classes, if it continues, will end the American project. To forestall misinterpretation, let me say a couple of things that the book does not try to demonstrate. I am not forecasting America's decline as a world power, nor do I argue that America was ever a classless society. From the beginning, rich and poor have usually lived in different parts of town and gone to different churches and had somewhat different manners and mores. It's not the existence of classes that is new, but the divergence of those classes on some core behaviors and values. But what I call the American project wasn't about international power or economic wealth. The American project consists of the continuing effort begun with the founding to demonstrate that human beings can be left free as individuals and families to live their lives as they see fit, coming together voluntarily to solve their joint problems. The polity that was based on that idea led to a civic culture that was seen as exceptional by all the world. It wasn't just Americans who claimed it, everybody saw it. That civic culture was so widely shared among Americans that it amounted virtually to a civil religion, and it's that culture that is unraveling. I'm going to have to move very quickly through a lot of different topics, so it's going to read a little bit like a telegram, but we can elaborate on some of it during the questions and answers. First, let me quickly talk about what I mean regarding the new lower class. I'm going to use two symbols of upper middle class and working class. That's different from the upper class and lower class. The upper middle class consists of people who have a college education or are working in the are working in the professions or in a managerial job. Just about everybody in the room. Upper middle class on up. Working class, as I define it, is people with no more than a high school education, and who, if they are working in a blue-collar job or a low-level service job or a low-level white-collar job. I name these two groups Belmont and Fishtown. For the upper middle class, Belmont was the home of my co-author on the bell curve, and it is a classic, affluent Boston suburb. Fishtown is in Philadelphia, and it's been a white working class neighborhood since the Revolution. So those are my labels for white working class and the white upper middle class. Why white? Very simple, because I'm going to be talking about social problems, and whenever you do that in this country, there is a very natural process that I can just see going on in the audience's mind where they're saying, well, how much of what he's talking about is because you've got special problems in the black community or special problems with immigration? In this case, I'm talking about non-Latino whites. Every number I'm about to give you, non-Latino whites. So none of those can be used as ways to explain away the problem. Okay. On a couple of core behaviors and institutions, let's start with marriage, than which there is no more important cultural institution, period. The rhetoric has it that marriage has been breaking down all over America. In fact, there has been a very different trajectory in Belmont and Fishtown. 1960, just about everybody was married in both Belmont and Fishtown. If you're talking about people ages 30 to 49, which is the age group I will focus on, because that's people in the prime of life. 30 to 49, 94% of people in Belmont were married, 84% in Fishtown. Overwhelming norm in both places. 2010, it's down to 48% in Fishtown. A minority of adults aged 30 to 49 are married in Fishtown, whereas it's still in the 85% range in Belmont. That is the collapse of a social institution. Out of wedlock births. We've all known for a long time that the African American community has very high ratio of out of wedlock births. Guess what? In Fishtown, about half of all children are now born to single women. And those are numbers that we are accustomed to thinking of in terms of minorities. Another symbol of a divergence on a core institution called marriage. Work is just about as close to being a core institution because industriousness was a defining American characteristic. I mean, from the found, everybody in Europe has always said, Americans work to live while Americans live to work while Europeans work to live. Well, we have been industrious, and we still are in the upper middle class. Belmont is still working very long hours. In Fishtown, white males aged 30 to 49, as of 2008, before the recession hit, about 1 out of 8 of them was not even looking for work. They were out of the labor force. Then you add on the unemployed on top of that, and you're talking about a big chunk of population, which back in 1960 was all in the labor force, 97%, something like that. Again, a divergence on core behaviors and values where the classes in America did not used to be separated. I have in the book discussions also of divergence in honesty and divergence in religiosity. I'm going to skip those just because I have so much material to cover, but I'll be happy to talk about them during the Q&A. The short story is, on these two, you've seen this divergence between the classes. I should say quickly that a couple of the obvious explanations don't work. I don't focus on causes in this book because I'm trying to talk to everybody. And so if I rehearse the arguments I made in Losing Ground, which I still believe, that the reforms of the 60s jump-started a lot of these problems, I'm going to have a lot of people on the left who are going to take the book and throw it against the wall and stop reading. And there's no point in making that case, because here is the truth. The toothpaste is out of the tube. And you can't reverse these trends with a few simple changes in government programs. It's got to happen because of broad shifts in the culture. And the only way for those to happen is to persuade a whole lot of people to think about things a different way. And that's what I'm trying to do with the book. In any case, a couple of simple explanations that don't work. It's not globalization, and it's not that jobs disappeared. It's not that working class men used to be able to make a family wage that could support a family, and now they can't. If you look at constant dollars, working class jobs now pay just as much as they did in 1960. They don't pay more, I mean, there really has been stagnation of wages in the white working class, or the working class generally, but they make as much. So if you could support a family in 1960 with the average working class wage, you can support a family now. The other thing that doesn't explain it is economic hard times. The drop in marriage and the rise in dropout from the labor force happened during the boom years of the 1990s just as rapidly as they did in others. There's just simply no relationship between the state of the economy and the growth of these problems. It may be said without hyperbole that taking all of these changes together put Belmont and Fishtown into separate cultures. Just as briefly, let me recapitulate my argument about the formation of the new upper class, which in some respects may hit kind of close to the bone with this audience. In 1960, the members of the American elite, and by that I mean the people who occupy the most important positions in the politics, economy, and culture of their own cities or nationally, had their success in common, but they didn't have a common culture in common. Most of them were high school graduates as of 1960. Even those who had college degrees, typically the first of their generation to get a college degree, and they had grown up in the working class or the middle class. They lived in bigger houses, and they drove fancier automobiles than those who weren't members of the elite, and they spent more on their food and clothes and vacations, but they did not share a culture in common. They did not have distinctive tastes and preferences. Now they do. The members of the new upper class, for example, just illustratively, watch very little television. And in some circles, you will actually have people brag that they don't even have a television anymore. Or they have a television, but they use it to watch DVDs or reruns of Masterpiece Theater. But that's all. The average American watches 35 hours of television a week. That is a whole lot of popular culture to which members of the new upper class are exposed virtually not at all. The members of the new upper class don't see the most popular top-grossing movies. They have distinctive reading habits, drinking habits. They have distinctive diets. They differ from mainstream America in the age at which they marry and have children. A bunch of you have kids, I bet, in private schools around here. Ever notice the age of the parents at Parents' Night? I mean, there are lots of geriatric parents in K-12. And by the way, I'm speaking as someone, my youngest child was born when I was 46, so I'm not exempting myself from this. They differ from mainstream America in the books they read and the humor they enjoy and the way they take care of their bodies and the way they decorate their homes, their leisure activities, their work environments, and their child-raising practices. Together, these practices have engendered cultural separation. And I would submit, by the way, that I'm not talking just about latte liberals. The Dallas new upper class, there's probably a higher chance of a child in the Dallas new upper class getting spanked than there is for the children of the new upper class in Berkeley, California. Okay, there are some differences in the culture, but an awful lot of the culture of the new upper class cuts across political lines. The new upper class is detached from the lives of the great majority of Americans, not just by their tastes and preferences, but by spatial separation as well. The members of this elite have increasingly sorted themselves into hyper-wealthy and hyper-elite zip codes that I call the SuperZips. In 1960, you say, well, what's different? There's always been elite neighborhoods in the United States, and there have been. But in 1960, if you take places like the North Shore of Chicago, or the Upper East Side of New York, or Beverly Hills, or the other famous elite neighborhoods, the median income, I did this for 14 of the elite neighborhoods as of 1960, the median income was just $84,000, and that's in 2010 dollars. $84,000 is not affluence in purchasing power. 26% of people in those elite neighborhoods had college degrees, basically 1 out of 4. By 2010, in those same 14 neighborhoods, median income was up to $163,000, and the percentage of people with college degrees was at 67%. It was a huge change, which meant also a great reduction in the diversity in those elite zip codes. Now, you may not realize this, but you have some SuperZips here in Dallas, and I bet some of you are wondering if you live in them. So here you go in Dallas. Here are the highest. I rank these by centiles. So the 99th centile. If you live in a zip code at the 99th centile on a combination of education and income, both of those together, that means that only 1% of the American population lives in a zip code with a combination of education and income as high as yours. Here we go. At the 99th centile in Dallas, you have 75225. I ought to ask people to put up their hands, but I won't. 75225 and 75205. I have 95205 here, but I don't think you have a 95. 97th centile is 75251. 96th centile is 75248 and 75252. And the 95th centile SuperZip is 75230. You also have lots of them outside of Dallas, especially north of Dallas, that qualify as SuperZips. The good thing about Dallas is your clusters aren't nearly as big as they are in other parts of the country. That is, you have adjoining zip codes that are not nearly as stratospheric as that, and that's good. If you talk about places like Washington, D.C. and New York City and San Francisco, the whole corridor going down to San Jose and Los Angeles, that's not true. You have huge clusters of contiguous super zip codes, and what that means is that it is very easy in those zip codes to live your life without ever moving outside them, except to go to the airport and fly off to Biarritz or someplace. There is a great deal of isolation just in day-to-day life. Now, here's where we get to one of, I think, the most crucial problems. If you have grown up in a working-class family or a middle-class family and then you get rich, and live this life, you bring with you your childhood. You bring with you all those memories. You are familiar in your bones with a lot of the aspects of what America is like outside this bubble. To the extent that you are second generation or third generation, you do not have access to that kind of perspective and that kind of balance. And increasingly, the people who are rising to positions of influence in this country are second generation and third generation Belmont, and that creates real problems because these people have enormous influence over the culture, politics, and economy of the nation, and in some sense, they don't get it. I mean, they don't understand what life is like for most of the rest of America outside the bubble. So those are the problems. Fishtown's falling away from the basics of America's traditional civic culture and the formation of a new upper class that is increasingly ignorant of and isolated from the rest of America. I've gone over those pretty quickly. I should emphasize, if it sounds sketchy, that the claims I have just made during these last few minutes took 231 pages of the book to lay out. So why do these problems matter and what happens next? Well, they matter for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons they matter has to do with social capital, which is the social sciences term for the hundreds of types of interactions within communities that make communities communities. Some of them are formal in terms of civic participation in organizations or religious participation. A lot of them are just informal. They're volunteering and activities in the workplace and informal neighborly activities. We know, we meaning social science knows, the book Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam is the first major text on this, that social capital has been declining very rapidly in the United States since the 1960s. I consider that significant, that the 1960s is when it started. And it's declined most severely in Fishtown. Now, there are a lot of people in the new upper class who aren't bothered by the loss of community because, frankly, community is not where they live their lives. They live their lives in places where actually they need to get away from things and they want to be alone. And their lives are very satisfying in terms of their family life and their vocational life, perhaps their religious faith. But the fact that the community is not particularly vibrant doesn't make much difference. Let me assure you that is peculiar to a fairly narrow stratum of American society. For the great majority of Americans, it makes a great deal of difference when you have a neighborhood with very weak social capital. It is more vulnerable to crime than one with high social capital. A neighborhood with weak social capital must take its problems to the police or to the bureaucracies because the resources for dealing with those problems in the community has atrophied. The small daily pleasures of just interacting with neighbors and storekeepers dry up when social capital has become weak. The sum of it all is that places with weak social capital are ones in which people generally live less satisfying lives than in places with high social capital. They are less happy lives. And that brings me to the second reason why these trends are important. Since 1988, I have been interested in, I published a book in 1988 called In Pursuit, and it was about the relationship of human happiness to public policy. And it's been a subtext of everything I have written since. I don't have time to discuss it at length today, but I will just say very briefly, it uses a definition of happiness that's very Aristotelian, but also pretty commonsensical. The definition is happiness consists of justified and lasting satisfaction with life as a whole. And my proposition is that essentially those deep satisfactions that go into happiness come from just four institutions of meaning, I will call them. And they are family, vocation, community, and faith. You don't have to tap into all four. There are happy atheists and there are happy single people. That's fine. But I'm saying deep satisfactions only come from those four. And I have consistently over the years challenged people to give me a fifth. Now, I will say there's a proviso. Vocation can include avocations and it can include causes. But with that proviso, I'm saying, where else is it that you get something that when you reach the age of 70, you look back on and take deep and great satisfaction with? Well, insofar as I'm right about that, and I will skip all the social science data that I cite in the book saying, yes, I am right about that, when you have seen the diminution of marriage and work and religiosity in Fishtown, you are seeing lives that have been denuded of resources for pursuing satisfying lives. And that's a second reason these trends are really important. The other reason, the ultimate reason why these trends are important involves the survival of the American project that I mentioned earlier. National life based on the founder's idea. And here's a wonderful quote from Thomas Jefferson that sums it up. In his first inaugural, he gave this. Thomas Jefferson said, "The sum of good government is a state that shall restrain men from injuring one another and shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement." That's what the American project was, and at this point in our history, that is going away. We have a larger and larger element of the population, which includes the leadership of the Democratic Party. It includes many prominent academics, and some considerable portion of the American electorate who think that concept has been overtaken by events and that the European model of social democracy is superior. More than ever before in our history, we have a major political push for a transformed America that implicitly repudiates the continued validity of the American project. So that's another reason it's important. What happens next? Well, I conclude the book with an optimistic scenario and a pessimistic scenario. And you know, Which one I believe has the better chance sort of varies from day to day. I mean, sometimes I wake up and I'm more optimistic, and sometimes I'm pessimistic. I will just simply sketch out the two broad possibilities. One is that we're doomed. Feel-good books have never been my strong point. We got all these problems in the new lower class. Well, what if you also have a new upper class that in its own way is just as dysfunctional as the new lower class? And that's a possibility because there are some signs that the new upper class is hollow at the core. By that I mean several things. One is a loss of self-confidence. There are a variety of ways in which I believe what we call non-judgmentalism is in fact a symptom of that loss of self-confidence. The upper middle class in general and the new elite in particular refuses to preach what it practices. I mean, in fact, the upper middle class pretty much gets married and stays married, pretty much works really hard, and even in religiosity and honesty, doing pretty well. But it won't say, we behave this way because it's a deeply satisfying way to live a human life. Instead, they say, but of course, we're in no position to make judgments on other people who make other choices. That contrasts with what the British Victorians did in the 19th century, when essentially the upper middle class in Britain had a set of moral values, and they propagandized the entire British nation into accepting them, and with wonderful results. The American new elite does not have that kind of confidence. There is also another problem that to me is a symptom of the hollowness at the core, and I will call that unseemliness. In a free society, a great deal of what makes the free society work is not laws, it is common understandings of what is seemly and unseemly. And I think a lot of the anger of the Occupy Wall Street movement isn't about how much money the top 1% has. It's the way they got it and the way they flaunt it. The sense that things are rigged. I think crony capitalism is a strong sign of that. That you have people at the top in a cozy little club trading favors back and forth. Unseemliness can also take the form of the former president of Pfizer Corporation, who after a tenure that saw the stock price plunge, took a golden parachute worth over $100 million. Well, he wasn't doing anything illegal. It was in accordance with the contract he signed with the board of directors. It was unseemly. A lot of what goes on in Washington is unseemly. It's not illegal, it's just unseemly. And that, to me, too, is a sign of an upper class that is not in a position to exert the kind of moral leadership that a vibrant society requires. Optimism? Well, to the degree to which 4 predictions are borne out, we have a shot. And here are the 4 predictions, which I will just basically state and then stop. First, we in America will be watching what happens in Europe, and it is not going to be pretty. Social democracies of Western Europe, as well as Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal, are going to be bankrupt within the next 20 years without major reforms. They just cannot sustain the social democracies that they have set up, and we're going to be watching that process, and we may say to ourselves, we don't want to go down that road. The second prediction is that science is going to undermine the moral underpinnings of the welfare state. A lot of the advanced social democracies have depended on the assumption that there is no such thing as a fundamental human nature that government must accommodate itself to. The neuroscientists and the geneticists, I believe, are going to throw that idea out the window. I think that as you look at the developing science, guess what? They are finding out that these age-old assumptions about human nature are actually true. it's not that they're discovering anything startling, you know. If you ask me to give you an example of what this emerging literature is proving, I can give you no better case than that science has proving beyond the shadow of a doubt that men and women respond differently to babies. But it makes a difference that science is proving it. It doesn't surprise anybody in this room, but there is a vast industry that is predicated on the assumption that men and women, if they're raised in the proper non-sexist environment, will have all sorts, you know, they will be equally attracted to babies and equally attracted to electrical engineering. You know, and it's just really unlikely. And once that's proved, you've got a shot. Third, it will become increasingly obvious that there's a simple, affordable way to replace the entire apparatus of the welfare state. I must take mild issue with John Goodman as he pointed to his excellent new comprehensive way of dealing with the welfare state all at once. I did publish a book a few years ago, John, called In Our Hands, which was a plan to replace the welfare state, which sort of did that, but with a guaranteed income. I won't go into a defense of a guaranteed income. I'm simply saying we are going to be spending so much money on the welfare state in this country as these costs go up that it's going to become ridiculous to everyone that we are spending this much money and we still have people in need. There's got to be a simpler way. And finally, the persistence of the Americans' allegiance to the American project just may turn out to be far greater than my argument so far has acknowledged. The United States has a wonderful history of confounding critics in this regard. So we may pull this out in the end. In the meantime, if you're asking me what my 5-point program is, I don't have one. What I can do with this book is try to start a conversation. And that's the only way we're going to make progress, because there are no government programs that will fix this. The only way that it will be fixed are by people taking a new look at their lives and saying, is this the best way to live my life? And in some ways, might life be richer and more textured and more fun if I made other choices about how I did it? However, I have kept you already longer than I intended to, going through a very long and complicated book in a very brief form. I hope, as a result of that presentation, to convince you not that there are solutions, but I do hope I've convinced you there is a problem. Thank you very much.
Hello. By definition, the elites that you've identified are responsible for public policies that have supported the growth of this underclass you've identified.
Yeah.
And I wonder about that responsibility, and also, aren't we, because of their increasing isolation of the elites, aren't we in danger of, or headed toward a bourgeois revolution to overthrow the elites of the Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party people, and so forth?
That's a really interesting proposition. But we've got a strange thing that has happened. You know, in previous eras, revolutionary eras, a huge amount of talent has been scattered at every level of society. Because if you just go back 100 years, and let's say you're talking about the top 10% of the ability in the country, whether you're talking about cognitive ability or however you want to define it, if you take that top decile, the majority of people in that top decile of ability were blue-collar workers and small storekeepers and farmers and housewives, because there simply weren't enough jobs to soak up nearly all the talent there was. This country has gotten really efficient at identifying talent from all kinds of backgrounds, including disadvantaged backgrounds, and funneling it off to colleges, and not only to colleges, but to elite colleges. It does a terrific job of this, and that's positive in one sense. Gives people a chance. That's great. That's the American way. It has also meant a couple of things. One of them is that if you're talking about raw talent, an awful lot of that is being pushed into Belmont. A lot of it into Belmont. And the second thing is, there's been a fundamental change in marriage habits. You know, the guy who rose from the bottom and made a huge success of himself 100 years ago probably married the girl next door, or if he had entered richer social circles, he married a girl he met at the country club who had only a 50-50 chance of being above average in IQ. These days, the graduate of Harvard Law who got into Harvard Law because of his stellar achievements is marrying the colleague he sees sitting across the table from him during a negotiation who got her law degree from Yale because of her superb qualifications. And guess what? They tend to have really, really smart kids. And that's been going on a large scale. So I'm not saying there is not the talent else. There are lots of interesting, smart people everywhere in American society now. But to a remarkable degree, this society is sucking talent into the top tiers socioeconomically.
What percentage of the children in Belmont go to private school as opposed to public school?
I can't give you the answer to that offhand. I will say, first place, it's not just what percentage of them go to either private schools or to really, really good public schools, which are inhabited almost exclusively by kids just like them. The bigger the bubble, the more likely it is that the public schools within the SuperZips are indistinguishable from private schools in terms of their membership. I was just talking this morning with a member of the audience who was talking about that he grew up in a Belmont-like neighborhood as a child, but within 3 blocks of their neighborhood was a working class neighborhood. And so when they went to the public schools, there was a huge range of kids there. That was also true in my high school and my background when I was growing up. And I bet it's been true of a lot of you. When you get into a big bubble where you've got 15 SuperZips contiguous to each other, that's gone. The only kids in that public high school are kids just like each other. And that takes up a very large percentage. Again, Washington, New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. That's really true. Yes, sir.
Charles, I know you concentrate on marriage, but what does survey data show why young women, say at the age of 25, are becoming single mothers at such a rapid pace?
Why are they becoming single mothers? Yeah, that you put your finger on a very important trend. We used to think in terms of the high school girl getting pregnant because of they made a mistake in the backseat of the car. That's increasingly not true. Single mothers are increasingly in their 20s. Well, if you go to Fishtown and you ask why they aren't married, here's the answer you will get. Why should I marry these losers that surround me down here? Here I am, I'm working hard at a job. This guy, he's a nice guy, I like him, but he can't hold on to a job, and in fact, he's living off me. Tell me why I should marry him. There has been enormous demoralization, from one perspective, of males in American working class. And again, the causes are really interesting to think about, but it's the reality of the change that I think we have to focus on. 50 years ago, to be a fully grown man in America, whether you were working class or upper middle class, you worked. Even if you had a trust fund, you were supposed to work. And people who didn't, were seen as kind of a feat and not very interesting. And you had status in American working class communities if you were supporting a wife and children. And if you were not doing that, you did not have status. This is not nostalgic. This is a reality about how Americans looked at male and male responsibilities. Today, it is also a reality. You do not get status for holding on to a low-income job and supporting a wife and children. So if you got that going, if you have that fundamental change in the status associated with certain kinds of behaviors, you are also going to get a big change in behaviors. And the fact is, males in the working class of America, and specifically the white working class, have become a pretty sorry lot. Am I missing somebody over here? Yeah, let's go to the other side of the room.
Have single mothers raising their children led to more ambitious young women?
More ambitious young women?
Now we have more women in college than men?
No, I don't think that. I don't think that would be the explanation of that. By the way, I would simply point out that when it comes to single mothers, they are really rare in Belmont. you're talking of the percentage of births to single women who qualify who come from Belmont families, still in single digits. It's not that much higher than it was in the 1950s. No, I don't think that would account for it.
You touched on status in Fishtown. Can you talk about the loss of stigma and shame that has taken place?
Yeah, it's amazing the degree to which a free society depends on stigma as a way of functioning, because you can't make laws against things. May I also say that stigma is one of the least punishing forms of trying to have social control? I mean, if the alternative is putting people in jail or prosecuting them, so forth, stigma looks pretty good as an alternative, as a way of deterring behavior and as a way of punishing behavior. And it has to be. It was John Goodman sitting at lunch who gave me, I think, a very good way of thinking about this, when he said culture is a public good. It benefits everybody, but it has to be sustained, and stigma and norms are a way of doing that. But I would point out you've got two sides of a coin, because at the same time that you stigmatize certain behaviors, by contrast, you can then praise other behaviors and give status for other behaviors. And if you don't stigmatize certain behaviors, you can't praise. You can't just praise something without also stigmatizing the opposite. And with non-judgmentalism, we simply withdraw this mechanism for influencing social outcomes, and we jeopardize the culture. So, I'm all in favor of stigma. I've gotten in trouble for saying that at certain college audiences, but it's the least punishing of the alternatives.
In terms of the trends and what you're doing, there are a couple of different things I was going to say and just get a reaction to it. But in terms of your statistics, was there a difference in flyover country, which we might be part of? In some places, they do consider us part of flyover country versus the coast in terms of your sampling and that sort of thing.
Part of me, since I come from Iowa, my wife comes from Iowa, wants to say yes, because I still think Iowans, and Midwesterners and the rest of us in flyover country are morally superior. However,
well, we are, aren't we?
I got bad news for you. There is a book, I wish I could remember the title of it, but it's set in Oldwine, Iowa, and it's called Methland. That's what it's called, Methland. And it documents in great anthropological detail what's happened to the town of Oldwine because of the meth epidemic there, a methamphetamine epidemic. But in my view, the reason you have a methamphetamine epidemic is not just out of the air, it's because of the breakdown of these other things like marriage and work and so forth. And throughout the Midwest and throughout flyover country, there is a real breakdown in working class community life. And lest I have not painted a dark enough picture, notice I've left out half of the population. The upper middle class constitutes about 20% of whites, and the working class constitutes about 30%. So that leaves 50% that are in the middle. They are also in the middle of all these indicators, which means that marriage has been sliding down in the middle class too, work effort has been sliding down in the middle class, and so these problems are seeping up. So in other words, there are more problems in flyover country than are visible on the radars that New York and Los Angeles use, but they're there. Okay. We have now reached 12:15, and we promised to let you go at that point. It's wonderful to be back in Dallas and wonderful to be back in front of the NCPA. Thank you very much.